wild hunt is an intriguing thing. Something that can be precisely defined yet also defies definition, which exists as a specific group of beings and a type of group more generally, which embodies nightmares yet also carries blessings. Possibly rooted in ancient warrior cults and medieval witches' rites, the wild hunt continues those themes but also has expanded far beyond them. If this seems maddeningly vague and contradictory, that's because it is, and yet understanding the hunt can only come from embracing that madness and contradiction. It is simultaneously multiple, diverse, different things and the sum of its long, convoluted history. As with so many things around folklore, myth, and spiritual beliefs, much of what will be discussed in this video can be debated, and how widely or narrowly the wild hunt is defined will depend on the individual doing the defining. To some scholars, including Eva Pox and Carlo Ginzburg, the wild hunt is a deeply rooted Indo-European belief which was passed down through subsequent cultures that developed from that core culture, and which has a range of regional expressions which all retain the concept of a supernatural procession connected to the dead and fertility. For others, including Ronald Hutton, the hunt is far more nebulous in its origins and less cohesive, representing beliefs which have developed and evolved across a range of time periods and cultures, and for which there is no clear-cut pagan origin or theme. Various arguments have been forwarded that the wild hunt doesn't predate the 16th century, that it dates back to at least the 12th century, and that it has much older pagan roots, with scholars largely unable to agree on either its source or antiquity. It is generally agreed that the term wild hunt was likely coined by Jacob Grimm in the 19th century for a collection of material that all shared a similar nature and which he brought under the umbrella term in his writing. However, who and what falls into that collection is not always agreed on today. For our purposes here, we will be casting a wide net and including a range of ideas and beliefs around the wild hunt. But we do want to acknowledge up front that some people may disagree with some of this material, and that is perfectly fair. Folk belief is often an opaque thing, and folk belief that stretches across millennium much more so. Nonetheless, we will try to show why each thing is included and present for the watcher the supporting evidence and, where applicable, the counter-argument. The wild hunt is a collection of spirits, supernatural beings that travel through the air at night, often in storms, usually led by a huntsman. Who the huntsman is varies as widely as the geographic areas the hunt is found in and the names it is known by. The core definition of the wild hunt is that they are spirits of some kind who hunt through the air, riding spectral horses accompanied by hounds, pursuing their prey relentlessly. They are usually led by a huntsman, male or female, who may be a god, fairy, mythic hero, or cursed human. Much of the folklore around the wild hunt is Christian in nature, although there are also more overtly pagan versions. The wild hunt is often described as perpetual in nature, something that is not constantly seen and may not always be active, but which represents a force that never rests. In the Christian view, the hunt is usually said to be cursed so that it can never stop its work until the end of all things, or Christian Judgment Day. In this sense, the wild hunt is an archetypical force, the embodiment of the spirit of hunting, which exists as long as the living world exists. In its earliest forms, the wild hunt was primarily noted as a visual phenomenon. That is, it was something that was seen by witnesses as well as heard. In these accounts, the hunt appeared to be tangibly real to those who saw it, and fully present within their reality. Later accounts and modern stories tend to emphasize the wild hunt as an auditory phenomenon. That is, something that is primarily heard rather than seen, and in some cases only heard and not witnessed visually at all. One theory of the origin of the Wild Hunt is that it began as a cult dedicated to the Norse god Odin, under variations of his older names, in which young warriors would travel out in processions masked and intimidating the dead or other spirits. These activities would be seasonal and may have acted as initiation rites or as fertility rites. This argument has been made since at least the early 20th century that the Wild Hunt had roots in ancient cults associated with warriors and likely connected to or dedicated to Odin. This living counterpart would have existed as a cult of masked youths who engaged in ecstatic practices to connect to Odin and the spirits of the ancestral dead, and held processions at certain times of year. These processions would be associated with the human dead, as Odin himself was. It should be noted here that Odin was not primarily viewed as a psychopomp, that is, he didn't guide the dead to the afterlife, although his Valkyries arguably did, but rather Odin's association with the dead came as their leader, both leading the Einherjar, heroic dead, in battle at Ragnarok, as well as leading the spectral procession of the dead later. The masked processions of warriors would have reflected these stories, and later possibly merged with or acted as the source for tales of processions of the dead through the skies. Through this lens, belief in the hunt didn't begin as entirely supernatural, but took on that appearance as the older, original practices behind it were lost to time, and the stories moved into legend. The Wild Hunt is also strongly tied to witches, particularly the medieval witches of Europe, who were thought to join the nightly cavalcade of the dead as part of their practice. Stereotypically, both the Wild Hunt and the witches' revels involved an airborne procession of spirits, usually made up of human dead, intrinsically linking the two concepts. This view leans heavily on Carlos Ginzburg's work and his arguments that the Wild Hunt was a nighttime excursion of the human dead, which was led by a pagan goddess associated with fertility, and that the witch's Sabbath journey echoed this theme by emphasizing the living witch's journey with the dead. In this view, the Wild Hunt and the witch's Sabbath journey are merely two perspectives on a single phenomenon, both of which merge the living and the dead, emphasize danger to those who cross paths with them, and emphasized ecstatic practices and experiences. The connection of the dead with fertility may represent an inversion of the usual cosmological order, so that fertility isn't the domain of women, but of the dead who converse so their nature can inspire and grant life, and the witch's connection to both the living world and the afterlife allows them to bridge these forces. Another possibility is that the connection to fertility comes in via the goddesses said to lead this procession, most often named as Abundia, Satia and Diana, although Perchta is later mentioned as well. Hutton argues that the Wild Hunt, as it is known today, is formed by amalgamating the older ideas of the witch's Sabbath journey and wandering dead with Jacob Grimm's later writing on the Wild Hunt, a term coined by Grimm, but this view does ignore the earliest accounts of the hunt, which predate both the witch trials and Grimm by centuries. Nonetheless, it is likely that the witch trial account of the witch's nightly travels and joining the airborne dead in flight reflected concurrent ideas about the Wild Hunt, and that the two shared wider themes. This link between the two reflected ideas of the time that the dead brought fertility into the living world and could be interacted with by living humans connected to esoteric practices, witches or shamans. It is possible that this view can be integrated with the previously discussed idea of the Wild Hunt as a later vestige of an earlier human cult practice. In this way, we might see the Wild Hunt as something which began as a human practice connected to spirits, morphed into a supernatural belief, merged with a later human magical practice or belief around witches, then returned to a supernatural belief, demonstrating both the adaptability of the concept and its persistence. Thus, The wild hunt may be linked to medieval ideas of the witches' processions or nightly flights, causing an overlap between the wild hunt as spectral supernatural figures and as supernatural human witches, although this blurring between the two seemed common in the medieval and early modern periods. In a modern context, the wild hunt and witches are often viewed as more distinct. Ultimately, it may be best to try not to limit your understanding of the wild hunt by thinking of them specifically as any type of spirit or emphasizing any one origin theory, but rather to appreciate the diversity. The wild hunt is, as we said at the start of this video, the sum of all of its contradictions. It is also something that transcends its own stories and limitations, shaping and reshaping itself across our understanding. If you want to learn more about the Wild Hunt, then please take a look at our book, Pagan Portals: The Wild Hunt by Morgan Daimler, who also provided the words for this video. This book is an introduction to the Wild Hunt, the group of spirits which hunt the sky, heralded by the baying of hounds and the sounds of horses' hooves in the air. With stories from across Europe and its history, the Wild Hunt is as intriguing today as it's ever been, and many modern pagans are drawn to learn about it and even interact with it. Here you will explore the history of the Wild Hunt and similar groups of spirits from Europe to the US, looking at who may lead the hunt and what its wider purpose might be. It's available from Moonbooks Publishing. Thank you so much for watching. A special thank you as always to our members. You too can become a member and gain early access to videos just like this one. Hit the join button for more information. Subscribe for weekly videos, ring the bell for notifications, and we will see you next time.